Ladies and gentlemen, honoured guests, and since this is a tourism gathering, my fellow rogues, reprobates, raconteurs, rascals, ruffians, rabble-rousers, revellers, and romantics, you are all in there somewhere. My name is Colin Bell from Natural Selection Safaris, and I would like to thank FHS very much for this extraordinary honour. I'm deeply grateful. I must begin with an apology that I cannot be with you in Nairobi today. I had a long-standing travel arrangement that I couldn't move, but please know that I would rather be in a room full of passionate, enthusiastic and quirky tourism and safari professionals than almost anywhere else on earth, except perhaps somewhere with an ice-cold beer alongside a great wildlife sighting. Receiving an award like this is an uncomfortable experience because the truth is that there are many more people far more deserving than I am. First and foremost are the field rangers across Africa. Every single day they head out into some of the most remote and difficult places on this continent, often putting their lives at risk to protect the wildlife on which our entire industry depends. Many live in tough conditions, far away from their families and with very little recognition and less pay. Yet they are the thin green line standing between Africa's wildlife and those who would plunder it. They are the real heroes of conservation. Then there are people like Kenya's Paula Kahumbu from Wildlife Direct and many other passionate and effective individuals. And there are organizations like African Parks, which take landscapes that have been abandoned or underfunded and transform them back to their fully functioning wildlife paradises that they should be. The entire African Parks team deserves an enormous recognition, but their CEO, Peter Fernhead, is one of the most modest and effective conservation leaders I know. The organization now manages and protects something like 20 million hectares of land right across Africa, and the ambition now is to grow that to 30 million hectares. What an organization. Frankly, Peter should be receiving this award, but in the meantime, I'm very happy to hold on to it for him. Since many of you here are investors, developers, and operators in the tourism industry, perhaps I can share a few reflections from someone who has spent more than 4 decades at the coalface of safaris and conservation in many remote areas around Africa. Our industry has much to be proud of, but we should also acknowledge that our past has not always been perfect. When I started as a young safari guide in the Okavango in the 1970s, tourism in Africa was largely an extractive industry, arguably the second most extractive industry in Africa after mining. Diesel generators ran camps all day, groundwaters were polluted by poorly processed sewage systems, and much of the revenue from safaris never even reached the countries where those safaris actually took place. One of the most painful experiences of my career came in the mid-1980s in Botswana when I witnessed the extinction of both black and white rhinos in the wild before my very eyes. In those days, one would drive and enjoy endless crashes of rhinos grazing peacefully in the floodplains. Then suddenly, in around 1986, they were simply gone. That emptiness and hollowness that follows an extinction is something you never, ever forget. And that emptiness and hollowness drives me today. It was a harsh lesson in how fragile these ecosystems and our wildlife really is, and how dependent they are on wise political leadership and pragmatic management of our national parks and reserves. Today, the tourism industry is a far healthier place environmentally. In many regions, tourism has become an incredibly efficient machine, generating jobs at scale, foreign exchange, taxes, and driving economic growth. In fact, perhaps too efficient. A traveler can now leave Europe, America, Asia, and within 24 hours find themselves watching lions and the rest of the wildlife in a pristine wildlife, magnificent landscapes, and with extraordinary sightings. What's the problem? Then they fly to another equally spectacular destination. What's the problem? But this efficiency often masks what lies between those gardens of Edens. Across vast parts of Africa, landscapes between these wildlife strongholds are under enormous pressure. Wildlife corridors are disappearing, communities are struggling, poaching is rampant, and ecosystems are becoming increasingly strained and fragmented. We're developing island economies. I believe that the next great mission for our industry is to reconnect these gardens of Edens, these islands, and invest in the landscapes in between them. The opportunities are enormous. That is what we need at Natural Selection and what we're doing wherever we can. Despite all its natural assets, Africa still receives only about 5% of global tourism arrivals and less than 4% of global tourism's revenue. The potential for expansion, if done correctly and away from the well-trodden roads, is immense. Botswana showed the world an important model with its philosophy of low volume, low impact, high value, and high job creation tourism. Rwanda has followed suit, and now mountain gorillas are almost at their carrying capacity. Thankfully, disapproving Diana's haunting prophecy to me in around 1988 that there would be no more mountain gorillas left in the wild in the 21st century. Thankfully, Rwanda's proved her wrong. Namibia took things even further by establishing community conservancies. Today, roughly about 1/3 of Namibia is under community-run conservation conservancies. Remarkably, there are now more black rhinos roaming freely and wildly on communal land in Namibia than inside all of their national parks. And rhino poaching in these conservancies is negligible, while rampant within their national parks. That is an extraordinary success story, and it happened because communities were brought into the boardroom of tourism. Then COVID arrived, and tourism collapsed right around Africa, almost overnight. And what did we learn? Number one, conservation does not create jobs for politicians and votes for politicians every 4 years. So governments will not allocate enough money to manage and protect Africa's parks. That's it. So the only option is tourism. And without tourism, most of our parks and conservation programs in Africa will simply not function nor survive. Conservation and management of our parks desperately needs tourism, but it must be a nurturing tourism that looks after people and environments, not crass mass over-tourism. At the same time, wildlife in Africa faces enormous demographic pressures. The next billion people added to the world's population will disproportionately live in Africa, and many or most of them will be living around the very protective areas this industry depends on. If tourism does not find ways to integrate and deeply entrench surrounding communities into its business models, not just through jobs, but through meaningful and fairly shared benefits, if it doesn't do that, the tourism and wildlife sector will face serious challenges and businesses will suffer. Consider this really sobering statistics. When I was born, there were roughly 450,000 wild lions across Africa. Today, there are only around 23,000. That's a decline of more than 95% in a single person's lifetime. Mine. Yes, there are still magnificent pockets of abundance, the wilderness we all celebrate and depend on. But across much of the continent, the broader picture is bleak and worrying. What will our grandchildren inherit? And what must we as an industry do now to ensure that they will still experience the magic of Africa's wild places? Allow me to close with a few messages, some for governments and some for my colleagues in the tourism industry. Firstly, we must be honest about the challenges within our own industry. Over-tourism is becoming a serious plague and a problem in some of Africa's most famous wildlife areas. In the Greater Mara area, for example, there are now around 183 lodges and camps operating across just around 300,000 hectares. It's extraordinary. It's crass, it's mass, it's horrible. A similar sized area in the Okavango Delta might be capped at around 15 lodges. Now that is foresight, planning and management. Similar pressures, often driven by short-term greed, or maybe a brown envelope, occur in the Ngorongoro crater, Mana Pools, Chobe, Victoria Falls and elsewhere. This pattern of overdeveloping in prime areas has to stop. And now the Tanzanian government wants to double the number of lodges and mobile safari sites in the Serengeti. Frankly, this is madness. Just because something is legal or permitted by a government does not necessarily mean it is wise and should be taking place. Developers and investors must think carefully before contributing to this overcrowding. If we destroy the very wilderness experience people from the outside world come to see, there will inevitably be a backlash. Damage to businesses and your brands will follow. Secondly, we must do far more to ensure that communities are fairly compensated for their land and for living alongside wildlife. And that cash and benefits must flow through the trusts and the councils to benefit the poorest of the poor. That is a great challenge that has to be overcome and is most difficult because the big people gobble up a lot of the money, and that has to stop. Thirdly, governments must recognize that tourism is the most competitive industry on the planet, and they must make sure that they have policies and the cash for marketing to cater for that reality. You know, if you're a country that exports bananas, you might compete against 50 countries. If you manufacture motor cars, you compete with maybe 30 countries. But when it comes to tourism, each and every country on this planet, every 200 of them, including North Korea, is competing for the tourism dollar. So countries in Africa have got to recognize this and make sure that they're doing the ultimate to attract the guests to their country. Because the tourists have the ultimate freedom of choice. If a country or a park damages its reputation through over-tourism, through unethical wildlife practice, canned lion hunt, all that type of stuff, or poor management, or even just grumpy immigration officials, travelers will simply go elsewhere. So governments must carefully consider carrying capacities, zonings, long-term sustainability, and also budgets for tourism marketing when making development decisions. And finally, to my colleagues in the tourism and safari industry, each one of us must ask ourselves a simple question. Are we part of the solution or are we part of the problem? Are we protecting the wilderness or are we quietly slipping a brown envelope across the table to secure the lease on your next lodge? The good news is that this industry is filled with extraordinary and passionate and talented people. The very fact that we are having these conversations gives me enormous optimism. What we have learned is that the more good one does for people and the environment, the better one's company performs. I think we all have to take a leaf out of Patagonia's 1% for the planet. That's 1% of gross revenues, which they set aside for good stuff, for conservation. We at Natural Selection decided we need to be 50% better than Patagonia. So we do the 1.5% of our gross revenues, not profit, gross revenues. And that goes across to conservation stuff before shareholders get a dividend. And we need to reflect on what the great environmentalist from Kenya, the great woman Wangari Maathai, once warned. She said, "The generation that destroys the environment is not the generation that pays the price." That is the problem. The wildernesses we celebrate today is not something we inherited from our parents. It is something we are borrowing from our children. So we as an industry, let's make sure when our kids inherit it from us, it is larger, wilder, and more alive than when we found it. Frankly, the opposite is too drastic to contemplate. Thank you very much, and I wish you well in your deliberations. Bye.